Hi everyone, welcome back, and today we're going to be finishing up chapter 10 and we're going to be talking about oligopoly. So first we want to talk about what an oligopoly is. This is the last market structure that we're going to cover in this kind of series that we've done looking at all these different types of market structures. As a review, we've already talked about monopoly. Monopoly is a market where we have just one seller that controls the entire market supply. And to break down this word, mono means single, and then this poly part comes from this Greek word polein, which means to sell. So monopoly just directly means that we have a single seller. Instead, what an oligopoly is it's a market that has just a few sellers, so just a few firms. So oligo means a few, and again, polein means to sell. So in this type of oligopoly market, instead of having just one seller or many sellers, we have just a few firms that are producing and selling this good or service. These producers are also selling differentiated products. This product differentiation is a characteristic that we talked about when we looked at monopolistically competitive markets in the first half of chapter 10. And lastly, in this oligopoly, there are some significant barriers for new firms to enter this market or for existing firms to exit. Now, the key things that we want to note here is that under an oligopoly, our firms do have some market power. Because they don't face a lot of competitors and they're selling this somewhat unique differentiated product, they have some control over the price that they charge. So oligopoly firms are price makers. Now, due to these barriers to entry, our oligopoly firms can earn some positive economic profit in the long run. This is just like what we saw under monopoly, except this power is going to be weakened for oligopoly firms because they still have to compete with a couple of rivals. So, due to these barriers to entry, that competition in an oligopoly is limited to just the existing firms, and these existing firms can earn positive profit in the long run. To provide some context about these different market structures and where oligopoly fits in, I've created this kind of number line or this spectrum here that is comparing our market structures based on how efficient they are. So perfect competition was our most efficient market. We had many sellers selling an identical product, and that price was pushed down because we have free entry and exit in this market. So we have the lowest prices and the greatest quantity of output being produced under perfect competition. On the other end of the spectrum, we have monopoly, which is our least efficient market structure. We have just one firm that controls the entire supply. They set the price based on their demand. And because of this, they restrict their output to raise the price of their product and increase their profits. So under monopoly, we have that deadweight loss or that inefficiency with high prices and low output. Our monopolistically competitive markets and our oligopolies fall somewhere in between perfect competition and monopoly. Monopolistic competition tends to be more similar to perfect competition. We have many sellers, they're selling some differentiated product, but there's free entry and exit in this kind of market, so these firms can't earn a positive profit. They still don't produce the efficient level of output, and prices are slightly elevated compared to perfect competition, but it's not as bad as a monopoly is. Now, oligopoly leans more closely towards monopoly. We have just a few sellers, and because of those barriers to entry, these firms can exercise that market power and earn economic profit in the long run. So an oligopoly is inefficient, but it's not nearly as inefficient as a monopoly is. However, where oligopoly falls on this scale depends on how these firms within the market behave. All right, so the reason that I say how close an oligopoly actually is to a monopoly depends on the way that these firms behave is because under an oligopoly, firms have this incentive to work together. And when firms work together, we call this collusion. So collusion is just an agreement between rival firms that specifies either the price that they're going to charge for their product or the quantity of output that they're going to produce. If these firms work together to collude, they can form a cartel. And so a cartel is formed when two or more firms act jointly as a monopoly. So instead of having 3 separate firms, here's firm number 1, firm number 2, and firm number 3. If these firms act independently, then we're just looking at a basic oligopoly. Each individual firm is going to decide on its own what price to charge or what quantity of output to produce. But if these firms collude and they work together to form a cartel, then they kind of just operate like one big firm. And so then we'd say that these oligopoly firms are behaving as a joint monopoly. The reason that these oligopoly firms want to do this is because by colluding and forming a cartel, they can push themselves closer to this monopoly market structure. This means that they will be able to charge a higher price and they will be able to collect a larger joint profit than they would if they all just made their decisions on their own. So this collusion or the formation of a cartel is very valuable to an oligopoly. These firms should be incentivized to work together so they can make more money. But in the real world, we see that this collusion is very unstable. And so just to quickly give an example of this, let's see why. So before we look at this example to find out why collusion is unstable, I want to introduce another term here that we're going to use to talk about a very specific type of oligopoly. And this is just a simple oligopoly where we have only 2 sellers. And so we call this a duopoly. So thinking back to our roots here, duo is 2, polane is to sell. So a duopoly is just a market that has 2 firms. So let's imagine in this duopoly market, we're looking at the market for cola. So we have Coca-Cola as one firm and Pepsi as the other. So Coca-Cola and Pepsi could agree to collude. They could agree to work together, operate as a joint monopoly to increase their profits. And so let's say that they do that. The CEO of Coca-Cola calls up the CEO of Pepsi and says, hey, I've got a great idea. If we both reduce our output, that will drive up the price of soda and we'll both be able to make more money. So the CEO of Coca-Cola is proposing this collusion. Let's say that Pepsi agrees, and so the firms get to work. They both restrict their output, which drives up the price, and their profits increase. But the thing about this is that when both firms restrict their output, one firm might get a good idea. So maybe Coca-Cola says, now that I've tricked Pepsi into reducing its output, if I increase my production, I'm going to increase my sales, I'm going to get a lot more customers in this market, and I'm going to drive up my own profits at Pepsi's expense. Actually, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi will probably come up with this idea. They'll both realize that by kind of, cheating on this agreement, they can increase their profits at the expense of their rival firm. So this collusion is unstable because both firms in this duopoly have this incentive to cheat on the agreement. It's hard for them to keep this agreement in place and actually extract this joint monopoly profit. So then one firm is going to cheat, and then we go back to this independent duopoly where our firms are no longer working together. Another thing that makes it difficult for oligopolies to collude and stay in this cartel formation is that they need to be able to detect if one of the member firms in the cartel has cheated on the agreement. So in the Coca-Cola versus Pepsi example, with just 2 firms or a duopoly, it's really easy for one of the firms to tell if the other cheated. If they know, hey, I didn't cheat on the agreement, it must be the partner that cheated, if they see some change in their sales or in the market price. So this key feature of oligopoly that we've kind of been dancing around and talking about without naming it is that firms in an oligopoly are mutually interdependent. This means that the actions of one firm affect the decisions of their rivals. So when Coca-Cola decides to change its level of output, this impacts the prices and quantities that Pepsi can sell. So any firm in an oligopoly is going to be very worried or is going to be very mindful of the decisions that its rival firms are going to make. So whenever an oligopoly firm is making a choice about how much to produce or what price to charge, whether or not to advertise, it's considering what its competing firms might also do. And this is very different than what we've talked about so far. Under perfect competition, we had many, many sellers. No single firm had any significant control over the market. So each firm is kind of like a drop in the bucket. If one firm decides to change its level of output, it's not really going to impact any of the other sellers in that market. Similarly, under monopoly, there are no other firms to compete with. So the monopoly just makes its decisions thinking only about itself. It doesn't have to worry about this interdependence. But under oligopoly, with just a few firms sharing this market, they're going to be very wary of what their rivals are going to do. So because of this, we need a new tool to analyze our firm behavior under oligopoly. The decisions that are made by oligopoly firms are a lot more strategic than the decisions that are made by monopolies or perfectly competitive firms. And so to do this, we're going to use something called game theory. As the number of firms in an oligopoly increases, it's harder to keep this cartel formation and it's harder to detect cheating. There's just more moving parts and it's harder to actually place the blame on the member firm that defected from this agreement. Another key point I want to mention before we get started talking about game theory is that collusion between firms and the formation of a cartel is illegal in most places. So here in the US, you have special laws that we'll talk about later that prevent firms from engaging in this kind of behavior because the belief is that it's not fair. So those firms are trying to work together to extract that monopoly profit, and this harms consumers by reducing the quantity that's sold in the market and raising the price. So this collusion and this formation of a cartel is not legal, and for this reason, firms will be very sneaky about how they actually go about colluding. Sometimes firms do this very implicitly by sending signals to one another that are very covert, that they like to work together. Other times, firms engage in other legal forms of collusion. So one form of this collusion that is legal is something called price leadership. Price leadership happens in a market where we have one really, really big firm that controls a significant amount of the market and a couple other smaller firms that share the remaining demand in that market. What will happen in this type of market structure, which is an oligopoly, is that big leader firm is going to set the price first. So this big leader firm makes its choice about how much to produce and what price it's going to charge. And these smaller firms just follow along because if they don't match what the leader's doing, then they might go out of business because of this mutual interdependence. And so this price leadership is not explicit collusion. These following firms are just following the leader, so this type of collusion is not illegal. But if firms are directly working together, like the example where Coca-Cola calls up Pepsi and they decide to restrict output, that is certainly not allowed. Because oligopoly firms are mutually interdependent, that means when one firm decides how much output it's going to produce or what price it's going to charge, it has to consider what its rival firms are going to do. So we're going to use this game theory to analyze firm behavior under oligopoly. What game theory is it's a branch of mathematics that is very commonly used by economists to analyze any kind of strategic behavior made by decision makers. So in this case, with oligopoly, our decision makers will be our firms. The reason we call this game theory is because we're just going to model our firm behavior like a board game. So in any game, we're going to have three key components. First, we need to know who the players are in our game. So for us, that's going to be our firms. Then we need to know what strategies or what moves are available to the players of this game. So for our firms, this could be what prices they could possibly charge, how much output they could produce, or maybe something more abstract like the decision whether or not to advertise. Lastly, we need to know what the possible results, outcomes, or payoffs are for this game. So based on the strategies or the moves that our players actually select, we want to know what the payoff or that result of playing this game will be. Now, if you think about a regular board game, a board game is usually played in turns, right? Player 1 goes first, player 2 goes second, player 1 goes again. To simplify our analysis, we're not going to have this game played sequentially or in turns. Instead, we're going to have our players play what's called a simultaneous game. And so in a simultaneous game, each player is going to make their move at the same time as their opponent does. So this means that each player chooses their strategy without knowing what their opponents are going to do. So each player is going to select their best move or their best strategy depending on what they believe their opponent is going to do. So each of our players are going to analyze the strategies available to them. They're going to know the possible payoffs that could occur depending on what they choose and what their opponent chooses, and they're going to pick the best move to maximize their payoff. To keep things simple, we're going to stick with this idea of a duopoly once we apply this game theory to our firms. So we're just going to have two players, and they're each going to have two strategies, and we'll have some different possible payoffs that result depending on which strategies are selected by our two players. So to introduce us to this idea of game theory and this simultaneous game, we're going to use an example that's removed from this oligopoly structure at first. So the game that we're going to look at is called the prisoner's dilemma. This is a very, very famous game in game theory. So in our game, we're going to present it as this kind of table. First, we have our two players. We have Tony Montana and we have Manny Ribera. So if you've seen the movie Scarface, these players are probably familiar to you. So let's imagine the premise of this game is this. Tony Montana and Manny Ribera have been accused of some kind of crime. They get called in as suspects for committing this crime, but the police don't have enough evidence to fully convict them of the maximum sentence. So what the police do is they split up Tony and Manny and they interrogate the two separately. So each of our two players face a kind of crossroads. They have two possible moves or strategies available to them. They can either choose to testify, where they admit to doing the crime, or they can choose to keep quiet, where they don't say a word and they don't admit to this crime that they may or may not have done. So, based on these two different strategies, we end up with four possible outcomes or four possible payoffs in this game. If Tony and Manny both choose to testify, then the payoff in this game is that they'll each spend 10 years in jail. Tony's payoffs are written in blue, and Manny's payoffs are written in red. So if both of our players choose to testify, we'll end up here. If both Tony and Manny choose to keep quiet, then they'll each only spend 1 year in jail. The police can convict them of some minor crime, but they can't convict them of the big job. If Manny chooses to testify, but Tony decides to keep quiet, then Manny will go free on a plea deal, but Tony will spend 25 years in jail. The reverse is true in the opposite scenario. If Tony decides to testify, but Manny decides to keep quiet, Tony goes free, and Manny spends 25 years in jail. Now, we call this the prisoner's dilemma because Tony and Manny can't work together when they're making their decision about what strategy to choose. So our players are moving simultaneously, and they don't know for sure what their buddy is going to do. So instead, what Tony and Manny will do is they will make their best choice. They will choose their best strategy depending on what they think their opponent is going to do. And the way that they decide what they believe their opponent is going to do is by looking at all of these possible payoffs or outcomes. They can expect that their rival player is rational and wants to maximize their payoff. In this case, maximizing the payoff is minimizing that jail sentence. So let's see how our two players are going to make their decisions. First, I'm going to imagine that I'm Manny. So I'm going to put myself in Manny's shoes, and I want to see what's my best choice here. So let's imagine two hypothetical situations. This is what Manny's going to consider when he's deciding whether to testify or to keep quiet. So hypothetically, if Tony Montana were to testify, Manny has the choice between testifying and serving 10 years in jail or keeping quiet and serving 25 years. So if Tony has already testified, Manny is also going to want to testify. 10 years in jail is less than 25 years. So if Tony testifies, Manny should also choose to testify. Now, if Tony chooses instead to keep quiet, then Manny should still choose to testify. He can either spend 1 year in jail if he says nothing, or he can go free if he chooses to testify. So what we've said here is that no matter what Tony does, Manny should always choose to testify. And this has a special name. We call this a dominant strategy. So a player in a game theory game is said to have a dominant strategy if there's one move or one action that they should always take regardless of what their opponent does. Manny always maximizes his payoff if he chooses to testify. Doesn't matter if Tony also testifies or if Tony keeps quiet, Manny will always be better off by choosing to testify. So testifying is Manny's dominant strategy. All right, now let's try and do the same kind of analysis for Tony. So we're going to put ourselves in Tony's shoes, and we're going to see what Tony should do depending on what he expects Manny to do. So if Tony expects Manny to testify, then Tony has the choice between 10 years in jail from also testifying or 25 years in jail from keeping quiet. So in this scenario, Tony is going to want to testify to reduce his sentence as much as possible. If Manny chooses to keep quiet, then Tony is still going to want to testify. Going free is better than serving 1 year in jail, so Tony will still testify. So both of our players in this game have a dominant strategy. No matter what Tony does, Manny's going to testify. No matter what Manny does, Tony is going to testify. So we call this a dominant strategy equilibrium. In this game, because our players can't work together, they just have to make their best choice depending on what they expect their opponent to do. This square right here is going to be the true result of our game. And we call this the dominant strategy equilibrium. So both Manny and Tony will choose to testify, and they will each serve 10 years in jail. Now, looking at the result of this, I tell you this is our dominant strategy equilibrium, that this is the result that we expect. You maybe are not convinced. You're like, well, why don't both guys just keep quiet? If they both keep quiet, then they only spend 1 year in jail each. The reason why it's difficult for our players to reach this cooperative outcome is because they can't work together, and there's this incentive to deviate, or this incentive to cheat. So let's imagine that before the police split Tony and Manny up, Tony says to Manny, hey, I'm going to keep quiet, you should also keep quiet, and then they won't be able to convict us of anything. So Tony tells Manny he's going to keep quiet, and maybe Manny is a good friend, and Manny decides that he's going to keep quiet. If Manny decides to keep quiet, then Tony is left with the choice between testifying or going free. If Manny is for sure going to keep quiet, then it doesn't make sense for Tony to also keep quiet. If Tony keeps quiet, he serves 1 year in jail, but if he testifies, then he goes free. So even though Tony has asked Manny to cooperate to reach this outcome, Tony can go back on that agreement, cheat on what he said to Manny, and he can maximize or increase his payoff. So this cooperative outcome is difficult to reach because there's this incentive to break the agreement, and because our players can't be sure that they can trust one another when they have to make this simultaneous choice. So this dominant strategy equilibrium that we identified is also something called a Nash equilibrium. In any game theory game that we present, there will always be at least one Nash equilibrium. This is named after John Nash, one of the founders of this game theory field. So in a Nash equilibrium, each player is choosing their best move or their best response to the strategy that was chosen by their opponent. When we reach this Nash equilibrium, there's no incentive for either player to deviate from their choice. By deviating, they would just make themselves worse off. So if we're here where Manny and Tony have both chosen to testify, there's no incentive for Tony to deviate and choose to keep quiet. If Tony were instead to choose to keep quiet, now he has to spend 25 years in jail. Same thing for Manny. If we're here in this Nash equilibrium, then there's no reason that Manny is going to want to switch from testifying to keeping quiet. It would actually hurt him to do so. Now let's see how we can use this same structure to analyze oligopoly firm decisions under a duopoly. Alright, so we have a new simultaneous game up here on the board. Now we're analyzing duopoly behavior. So we're sticking to our soda market. We have Coca-Cola and we have Pepsi. Those are our two players or our two firms in this duopoly. Let's say we're looking at this kind of classic decision for a firm. They want to decide how much output to produce, which will implicitly set the price and determine how much profit these firms make. So both players have two strategies available to them. They can either choose to produce a high level of output or to produce a lower level of output. If Coke and Pepsi both produce this high level of output, they each earn $100 million in profits. So our payoffs here are measured as profit. If Pepsi chooses to produce high output, while Coca-Cola only produces the low output, then Pepsi will earn $150 million in profit, and Coca-Cola will earn $75 million in profit. Let's use those same analysis steps that we did with our prisoner's dilemma game to see what the Nash equilibrium will be in this duopoly game. So first, I'm going to imagine that I'm Coca-Cola, and I want to see what my best response would be if I expect Pepsi to produce the high level of output. If Pepsi is going to produce the high level of output, then I'm faced with this choice between either $100 million from matching their output or for $75 million if I produce the low level of output. So as Coca-Cola, if Pepsi produces the high level of output, Coca-Cola will also produce the high level of output. Instead, if Pepsi were to produce the low level of output, Coca-Cola is still better off if they produce the high level of output. So Coca-Cola's dominant strategy is to produce this high level of output. There's never a situation where they can make more money by producing low output. Now, if we are putting ourselves in the shoes of Pepsi and Coca-Cola chooses to produce the high level of output, Pepsi is better off matching them and producing the high level of output. We're comparing this $75 million payoff to this $100 million payoff. Our firms want to earn as much money as possible, right? So they just want to pick the option that will give them more profit. Now, if Coca-Cola instead chooses to produce the low level of output, Pepsi is still better off producing this high level of output. Therefore, our results here, the square in which we have two circles, this is our equilibrium. There's no way for either firm to make themselves better off by choosing to deviate from their dominant strategy. If we're here, both firms have chosen high output, and Pepsi thought about deviating to produce a low level of output, they're just reducing their profits, so there's no incentive to deviate. Same thing is true for Coca-Cola. Just like we saw in the prisoner's dilemma game, though, our firms are missing out on this cooperative outcome where they can each earn a higher level of profit. Now, this cooperative outcome here is this collusive outcome if Coke and Pepsi joined together as a cartel and operated as a joint monopoly. When oligopoly firms work together as a cartel, they usually restrict output to keep their prices high and increase their profits. So this collusive behavior would be illustrated if both Pepsi and Coca-Cola chose to produce the low level of output. They restrict that output and they increase their profits. But as we said, it's hard for them to maintain this agreement because this cooperative outcome is not stable. Either player can try to increase their profits by deviating from the strategy that they used to get here. All right, lastly, I just want to touch back on some of this government regulation. So we've already said that collusive behavior and the formation of a cartel is illegal in most places. Here in the US, we have the Sherman Act of 1890 and the Clayton Act of 1914, which prohibit this collusive behavior. They say that it's illegal, and firms that engage in this behavior will be convicted of a felony. So even though we have these regulations in place, these antitrust laws to discourage or prevent this collusive behavior, it still happens all the time. There are ways that firms can kind of move under the radar and engage in this collusive behavior without being detected. But there are also scenarios where the government actually directly allows this collusive behavior to happen. There are some businesses that the government grants antitrust exemptions to, where they essentially allow firms to operate as an oligopoly. And there are other industries where the government's behavior creates an environment conducive to collusion. For example, when a government contract is posted and firms are able to bid on this contract, those bids are public information. So after the bids go through, the government will post all of the companies and the amount that they bid to win the contract. This bidding makes it really easy for cartels to detect cheating. If all of these member firms in a cartel were all bidding on a contract, but they all agreed beforehand what price they were going to bid, and then one firm cheats on that agreement, that's going to be just right there in writing for all those other member firms to see. So this ability to detect cheating through this government contract information, again, allows these oligopolies to operate in some cases. Okay, that's it for today. The last thing I will say is it's very important here with all of these market structures that we've looked at to review the traits of each market and compare and contrast those. If you look at the very last slide for the lecture slides posted in this chapter, you'll see a table that compares and contrasts our 4 different market structures based on their different features. I highly recommend looking at this, studying it, making some flashcards before our next exam. All right, thank you guys, and I'll see you next time.